Biggest myth, and I've mentioned this earlier in the podcast, is that this is where all the money is. And, that all of these operators, all of these brands, everybody's kind of flush with cash all the time. And the truth is, that is not the case in this space. I mean, we don't have safe banking. We're not able to access the same financial institutions that other industries are. And the investors in the space are, few and far between. And, even though the country is in a capital markets crisis in so many ways, it becomes much more amplified in the cannabis space. And so instead of, approaching it is that there's all this cash lying around and that you have everything you can spend, you really have to be scrappy here. This is all about being scrappy, being resourceful, doing a lot with a little.
Hey everyone, this is Devin Miller here with another episode of The Inventive Expert. I'm your host, Devin Miller, the serial entrepreneur that's grown several startups into 7- and 8-figure businesses, as well as the founder and CEO of Miller IP Law, where he helps startups and small businesses with their patents and trademarks. You ever need help with yours, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat. We're always here to help. Now, today we've got another great guest on the podcast, Laurie Parfitt. And Laurie, going to be talking about the space of in cannabis marketing and building brands in that space, and also some of the marketing myths within the cannabis industry, and also looking at marketing as it evolves with is it evolving connection with the consumers, and maybe what to invest or not to invest in marketing that might get you left behind. And if you don't have the products, all the marketing in the world won't save you. So it should be a great discussion with a lot of good topics to hit on. So with that much as an introduction, welcome on the podcast, Laurie.
Thank you so much for having me, Devin. I'm excited to be back.
Well, excited to have you. And for those that didn't catch it, so Laurie was a guest on our sister podcast, The Inventive Journey. So if you haven't had a chance to go catch up on her episode there, definitely make sure to do so. But for those that haven't had a chance to catch up, or just want the 1 or 2 minute version of it, introduce yourself a little bit. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Laurie Parfitt. I am your fractional CMO in the cannabis space. So what that means is I am your part-time chief marketing officer. Our firm, LKP Impact Consulting, helps brands, operators, technology, and ancillary services within the cannabis space who don't need or can't afford full-time marketing help. We provide everything that you could possibly need at a size and scale that works for your business. And so I actually started my career financial services, moved into CPG. I was in consumer packaged goods and consumer products for 17 years. Transitioned into cannabis as the head of marketing at a multi-state operator. And then from there, I ended up starting my own firm. And so I love being an entrepreneur and being able to support small to mid-sized businesses so that they can be successful in the cannabis space.
Awesome. Sounds like a fun and exciting job. So now with that, we'll maybe just dive into a little bit on the marketing, because I would say that, cannabis is a bit of a different product in the sense that it's state by state, and whether it's on the federal level, the state level, are polarizing as far as some people are supportive of it, some people are against it. And so how do you go about building a brand in that space, jumping into marketing, and kind of getting going for those that are considering getting into the space, or those that are in the space?
So the cannabis industry is unlike any other space. So we are not federally legal, as you know. And I always say that every state kind of operates as its own country. So all the laws are different, all the regulations are different. And, that's where the challenge in marketing really occurs, because when you're trying to build a brand, it's not like consumer packaged goods, where when I worked in consumer packaged goods, you could produce in one state, you could ship across the country. So the product you produced that was shipped to California was the same product that you would see in New York, same quality level, same type of environment for creation. In the cannabis space, you can't do it that way. There's only a few ways to truly build your brand. And up until I would say the past year or so, we really haven't seen a major proliferation of brands or like national brands that you would see in other spaces. So, like Nike, national brand, Apple, national brand. In food and beverage, you've got, Kraft cheese, that's a national brand.
Mm.
In cannabis, we don't see the same dynamics. So there's only a few ways to truly create a national brand. One is you start your brand in one state and then you prove success there. And if you're a multi-state operator, so it means you have operations and licenses in multiple jurisdictions, then you can take that brand into all of the states you operate in. If you're not, which a lot of brand operators are not, then you really have to find partners in each of those states because getting your own licenses in each of those states to run your brand is pretty cost prohibitive, as well as the logistics involved make it a little untenable for businesses. So what we're seeing a lot now is asset light brands where you have your brand IP, you have your SOPs, your work instructions, your formulations, and you find operators in all the states you want to work in and you partner with them and they help produce your brand. In some cases, they help distribute your brand. We're starting to see co-manufacturers and distributors pop up. We've seen those in consumer packaged goods too. They've been around a long time, but that's a new entry into the cannabis space that we are starting to see.
So
And
now,
so
if you do that, so let's say I have a brand that's in, whatever it is, because I would irony, or I don't know irony, but the similarity with law firms, a lot of times if you work on the state level, you only are licensed in one given state, and so you can kind of like a little bit like the cannabis industry, you can go get licensed or have people that are licensed in different states, but you're usually limited to a few or select locations, and so I just find that similarity a bit interesting. So,
yep.
but now do they, if I am licensed, let's say just in California, just as an example, and I want to go into other states, don't have the licenses or don't have the authorization in the other states, can you keep the brand consistency and you're just more having different distributors there? Or how do you co-brand it, or kind of walk us through a little bit, kind of how you keep a brand consistency when you don't have the license, you're not necessarily licensed in all the states?
Right. So when you're not the producer, that's where the real challenge is. And so a product for true brand equity, if you're producing a product in California, and let's say that is where you have a license, but now you want to move into Arizona and Illinois and Missouri and New York, you want the product that you produce in any of those jurisdictions to be the same as the product you produce in California. And that there's a lot of nuances that affect that. So the growing situation in California is different, how they produce is potentially different. And so it's really important to have very strong standard operating procedures, strong work instructions, formulations, and make sure that as you're building those contracts, that you have teeth in there, that the quality level has to be a certain way, and that you are going into those markets as you're producing and you are testing to make sure that those products coming off that line are at the standard that you would expect them to be at. Because if I'm in California and I love a brand, and all of a sudden I'm traveling to Illinois and I'm like, oh, great, the brand is here. I can buy it here. And it's not the same. I'm going to think that the quality level went down. And then maybe I will stop buying it in California because, you know, I think that they're now dumbing down the product. And so that's all about brand equity. And so I always tell brands that they have to be very present in the markets that they want to operate in. And they have to be very specific with their manufacturers to ensure that the product is being produced the right way. And like anything, you don't just want to be there at the beginning. You need to be there auditing on a regular basis because, like anything, when you start with somebody, that's when they're at their best. But as they get more comfortable, they sometimes start cutting corners. You want to make sure that that's not happening. You want to make sure that everything is at the level that you want it to be at, that it's not just that the testing standards are being met, but that the quality level, the experience that they're getting from that product is what you would expect it to be.
No, that makes sense. And, sounds like an extra added, I don't know, hurdle, but thing to do or put on the to-do list in order to make sure you have that brand consistency. But to your point, it'd be a little bit the same when you go to whether it's fast food place and you go from one state to the next, you expect that it has the same level of product and service and the same atmosphere and kind of what you've gone to expect. And one bad experience and one steak can lead you to leaving the brand or not, or utilizing it less. And sounds like that's what the cannabis industry is looking to establish, is how do you build that while you're having to work with the different licensing issues and different businesses that you're partnering up with and going through that space. Now, I know when we talked a little bit before the podcast, there was also a bit of maybe marketing myths that are surrounding cannabis and people thinking operations come first. And so walk us through a little bit of kind of what are those myths and kind of why are they wrong?
So when I entered the industry back in 2019, marketing was very, very secondary. And I wouldn't say it's changed that much, but it's gotten better. But when I started, it was all about getting your operations right. Because if you couldn't get product produced, all the marketing in the world wasn't going to save you. But 4 years later, operators have come a long way, and getting product produced has become much less of an issue. And so if you just focus on your operations, you're not going to be able to sell your product. And so marketing is what helps you get your product out there so you can actually sell it. And so back when I started, there were shortages of products everywhere. We didn't have enough canopy, and people were selling everything that they produced. I remember talking to operators, and I was trying to get brands licensed in these states, and they were like, "We can't provide biomass because we everything we produce we sell immediately." Those days are long gone. So now we're seeing operators with too much product who need to get rid of it. And so if you only focus on operations and you forget about marketing, you will be in a spot where you're going to have to destroy product. And there's nothing worse than doing that. And so the myth is that the product just sells. It just sells itself. It did at one point, not anymore. We have evolved to the point where now brands are popping up, quality levels are different, and how you communicate with your consumer needs to be thoughtfully cultivated. And so you have to have marketing. The other thing that I always hear is I have a lot of my former CPG friends, and I created these great businesses in other industries. This is where all the money is. This is where I want to be now. Cannabis is a tough industry. I don't think I have ever worked so hard in my life. People think that most of what we do is, it's fun and easygoing. And the truth is, it's a tough place to be. The hours that we all put in, the work that we're all doing is really challenging. And we're all in this space for the most part because we have a passion for the plant, we have a passion for the patient. We really want to make a difference in the world. We want to be part of a movement, part of something bigger than ourselves. If you come in here because you think that this is the industry where all the money is and that it's going to be super fun all the time, it's the wrong place for you. You'll be very disappointed. This is a very challenging arena. We don't get all the resources we need. Capital is tight. What we're dealing with right now in the space is equity investment is down 90%. Debt investment is down 40%. And so, access to capital to operate your businesses is challenging. We're seeing a weeding out. We're seeing operators going out of business in certain states. And so this is an area where you really have to have a lot of passion and a lot of love for what you're doing because it's not easy. And we don't do it because it's easy, we do it because it's hard. If it was easy, everybody would do it. And we see a ton of people come into the industry and leave because they didn't expect it to be so challenging.
Hmm. No, sounds like it's an interesting industry with a lot of opportunities, but or a few extra added things to get figured out, and miss the spell. Now, was that kind of is that evolved? So, in other words, and just curious more on that. People are thinking operations are first, and that you don't have to go out and establish a brand and market, and it will just kind of sell itself. Was that due to the fact that for a period of time it wasn't legal in very many spaces, and there was not a lot of producers, and it was a lot or low supply for high demand, and that's starting to switch, or what kind of motivated, or what kind of or caused the shift in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean, there weren't as many license holders. I mean, before it was, certain states were just coming online. You were just getting these programs up and running. They were starting as medical programs. There weren't a lot of rec programs. And so what you ended up seeing was you saw these medical, we would see lines around the corner for dispensaries. I remember helping set up dispensaries, and we would have to work with the cities to determine queuing on the street because we needed to make sure that there were walkways because we expected the lines to be around the block.
Hmm.
And we were limited on canopy because we didn't have enough license holders to be able to produce enough product in each of these states. And California has great growing conditions and they can produce a lot, but they can't ship it anywhere because everything you grow in your state has to be sold in your state. And so what we've seen now is we've seen states issue more licenses. We've seen a lot more operators popping up. And as a result, you now have to find differentiators as to why, if you're a dispensary, why should I as a consumer go to your store? Why should I go to you versus the 10 others that I passed on my way over? And so these differentiators are becoming much more important because we're seeing so many more operators popping up. In terms of brands, it used to just be sort of the MSO brands and a few other brands here and there. Now we're seeing a lot of new brands hit the street. And so why is your brand different? And I always love to talk to brands about the brand pyramid. So at the bottom of the brand pyramid, you have your points of parity. That's how you're like other brands. Then you move up to your points of differentiation. And it's always an interesting discussion when you talk about your points of differentiation, because they'll be like, oh, we have really cool packaging, or we have a great brand name. And I'm like, that's a marketing point of differentiation. But what is your product point of differentiation? Because at some point, you need a product point of differentiation. Why your product? There's a million vape companies out there. Why your vape? It has to be a true product differentiator. Why your pre-roll? Why your edible? What makes you unique and different? It can't just be marketing. It has to be a combination of marketing and product differentiation.
No, I think that's interesting. And now, and it's not an industry that I know a little bit about, but not a ton. Is there a lot? So if I were to go out and buy a car as an example, you have the different brands, you have the different models, you have the different features, you have the different price points. Is that similar in the cannabis industry? Are they starting to say, here are the different features or different price points, or kind of how are the brands starting to figure out how to distinguish themselves? Is there kind of, it seems like evolving or being pushed in that area when you're getting into that marketing? How do you highlight the differences?
So that's all about segmentation. And we're starting to see it pop up in this space. So when you look at any other product category, so if you take a grocery product category, you're going to have your value, you're going to have your mainstream, you're going to have your premium, your super premium. A lot of those are based on price, but they're also based on quality levels, unique inclusions, different formulations. And so we're starting to see that in the cannabis space too. It's just starting, I would tell you, because at one point it was just a free for all. Like all edibles were kind of around the same price, all vape carts were around the same price. Now we're starting to see that product segmentation, and the issue becomes, how do you communicate that to the consumer?
Hmm.
So cannabis is a new industry, and a lot of people who are coming into dispensaries now, maybe they've never participated before. Maybe they did in college, but that was just raw flower that they were smoking, and they didn't necessarily know what they were getting.
Hmm.
And so the options now are much more robust. And so how do you communicate that to the consumer? How do you educate them? And that's where there's a lot of struggle, because the consumer's already confused. And the last thing you want is a new consumer to come in and try a product and have a negative experience. And so it's going to be all about education, and how do you make sure consumers understand what they're getting and why they're paying more for something.
Hmm.
And that is right now, as marketers, where we see a lot of the struggle, because consumers just don't know enough. And the bud tenders that you're purchasing from, the turnover there is really high. And so you don't necessarily know how well educated they are as well. We're starting to see those platforms pop up. There's one here in Illinois that they're proliferating nationally. They're called Seed Talent. They actually work with a lot of these brands and put together educational programs with them. And then those go out to dispensaries, and dispensaries can have their bud tenders get trained on each of those brands and take tests, and they're incentivized to complete the course, so that they understand why that brand, what are those differentiators, where does this brand sit within the category. But that's all just kind of popping up now in the past couple of years. And so
Hmm.
it's going to be very interesting to see what other tools uh, are introduced, because that is what's going to help the consumer understand the category better. When they go to the grocery store, they're looking at pasta sauce, or they're looking at um, ready-made meals. They kind of understand the different quality levels, and they understand what those products are. In cannabis, it's still the wild, wild west.
Hmm. Interesting. So now one question as you're talking through that just came to mind, that or I had a question on this, because I mean, a lot of when you get e-commerce or get online, a lot of people, you do either traditional advertising on for e-commerce, which is either social media, you do Google AdWords, maybe do YouTube videos, something along those lines. Now when you get into licensing and or trying to extend your brands, maybe just within the state, or with partnering up with other distributors and brands and those that have licenses, and that, where do you go to, or how do you approach marketing? It seems like it's a bit of a has that potential. Do you just target it more narrowly and just people within that state, or do you go different avenues, or kind of how do you or tackle that marketing?
It's kind of a whole different dynamic than what you see in traditional industries. So because this is not federally legal, social media is one of the biggest places where people are advertising now. In cannabis, you can't do paid social, meaning you cannot have paid ads for cannabis on social media, with the exception of Twitter is just starting to allow it. But Twitter is also not the best platform for cannabis.
Hmm.
And so when you think about the marketing pillars you have available to you, they're a little different than you would see in other industries. In other industries, you could do TV, you could do radio. You're a little bit more limited on the cannabis side. So you have digital, and so that's going to be your programmatic, your Google AdWords. You can do little things here and there, but it's going to be very selective. So it's going to be about the publications that will allow you to do it. It will be about what kind of words you're using, because you don't want to get flagged and get knocked off. When it comes to social media, as I said, you can't do paid social.
And what is that
And
legally, or why can't you do pay? And it's just not an area that I'm as familiar with, so just or more personally curious, why aren't you able to do paid social?
so it's not necessarily legal. But Meta, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram, they prohibit it.
Hmm.
And so, even when you put a post out there, like it'll say like boost your post and you pay a little bit of money to boost your post. If you do that, the likelihood is you're going to flag Facebook or Instagram and you're going to get shut down. You can't do all those ads that you see because at the end of the day, you're violating their terms of service.
Hmm.
They're not friendly to cannabis on their platforms. And the reason for that, and it actually makes some sense, is that they can't prevent somebody under the age of 21 from accessing that content. They don't have that ability. And so every time as a cannabis company, and I always do suggest you have a presence on Instagram and Facebook, but you have to be very careful with how you do it. And I always suggest build community, educate. Don't put pictures up of you smoking. Don't put pictures up of the plant. That's the type of stuff that's going to flag them. Don't use cannabis hashtags because it's really not allowed. And so when you think about social media in every other arena, people invest a lot in social media. They get big agencies to do it. They do all of those paid ads. In cannabis, I always say, don't spend a ton of money on your social media because that 50,000 followers you have today could be zero tomorrow. And Instagram and Facebook are very inconsistent as to how they enforce their policies. And so you never know when you're going to get hit. And so you have to be very careful with that. LinkedIn is a very friendly platform to cannabis, mainly because they don't get a lot of under 21 on LinkedIn. And so they're able to be much more open about the cannabis space. And so I always love LinkedIn as an option for cannabis operators, but it tends to be a little bit more B2B. But even B2B, if you're an individual on LinkedIn, you could also be a cannabis consumer. So there is that aspect of it as well. And then TikTok is, it's not very friendly to cannabis. We are starting to see a lot of cannabis brands pop up on it, but the likelihood of being shut down is definitely on the high side. So, I always tell people if you're going to do social media, that's great, but just realize what the risks are and make sure that as you're looking at your marketing budget, you really think about how much you want to spend there because what you have today might not exist tomorrow. And so other avenues that you really need to focus on out of home. So that's going to be your billboards, your furniture, your bus stops. You have to look at what your regulations are in each state, each city, each jurisdiction. And the state might say you can do billboard advertising, but if the jurisdiction doesn't allow it, you won't be able to do it. You can always be more strict than the state. You just can't be less strict than the state. And so when you do billboards and all of that, you just need to make sure that with your provider that you're contracting billboards that are allowed for cannabis. And then the other areas I like to focus on are PR. I think PR is incredibly important and very impactful in this space and one of the best forms of marketing. So getting your story out to media, building your personal brands, making sure that those press releases are out there, that you're being quoted in articles, that you are thought of as a thought leader. That's really important for building your brand. And then the final pillar that I really like to focus on is activation. So how are you going to activate? What is that in-store experience? How are you promoting? What kind of educational programs are you going to have? What kind of pop-ups do you have? A lot of cannabis needs to really be done at a very grassroots level. Starting big and going narrow doesn't necessarily work here. You have to start narrow and start expanding to big. It's the difference between us and other industries.
Well, so it's interesting to learn a lot of the differences between the industry and then how, the different hurdles. And I don't know. I always look at hurdles as a It's a way for you to have a barrier to entry. And if you can figure that out and you can do well, you can separate yourself and thrive in an industry. And those that don't put in the time or effort to figure it out tend to be the ones that struggle. So certainly a lot of great expertise you shared and a lot of great information you've gone over. So now is already reaching towards the end of this episode or this podcast. Great time to transition to the two questions I always like to ask at the end of each episode. So we'll jump to that now. And we touched on it a bit before. We talked a little bit about the myths that are in some of the industries, but I'll ask the same or the final question nonetheless, which is if you're to or within your industry, what is the biggest myth and why is it wrong?
The biggest myth, and I've mentioned this earlier in the podcast, is that this is where all the money is. And, that all of these operators, all of these brands, everybody's kind of flush with cash all the time. And the truth is, that is not the case in this space. I mean, we don't have safe banking. We're not able to access the same financial institutions that other industries are. And the investors in the space are, few and far between. And, even though the country is in a capital markets crisis in so many ways, it becomes much more amplified in the cannabis space. And so instead of, approaching it is that there's all this cash flying around and that you have everything you can spend, you really have to be scrappy here. This is all about being scrappy, being resourceful, doing a lot with a little. And so, like I said, I see so many people want to come into this space or people who talk to me about it. They're like, oh, it must be so easy in the cannabis space. And I always say it's not. We don't do this because it's easy. We do it because it's hard. And we have to be much more creative with how we approach our businesses because what we have access to is not the same as what other industries have access to. And we have a much smaller pool to start with. So it's all about being agile and flexible and being able to turn on a dime and not having the resources available to you to get what needs to be done completed. So the cannabis space, it's a rough place. You have to have a true passion for what you do, a passion for the plant, passion for the patient, and a passion for helping the industry come into the light.
No, I think that's some great myths to dispel, but also great takeaways. So awesome. Well, as we wrap up the episode, thank you again for coming on the podcast. It's been fun. It's been a pleasure. Now, for all of you the listeners that are out there, if you have your own journey to share and you'd like to be a guest on the podcast, we'd love to have you. So just go to inventiveguest.com, apply to be on the show. A couple more things as listeners. Make sure to click share, subscribe, leave us a review. Always helps us to find even more startups and small businesses that we can help of them along their journey to success. And on that note, if you ever need help along your journey with patents or trademarks or anything else, just go to strategymeeting.com, grab some time with us to chat, and we're always here to help. Well, thank you again, Laurie, for coming on the podcast, and wish the next leg of your journey even better than the last.
Thank you so much for having me. I always love participating.